The idea of creating a life, or rather the general idea of life, an artificial life, goes back to the 16th century when alchemists attempted to create homunculus, which are small, man-made, fully formed humans. This never came to fruition, but the idea of creating a synthetic life form has long since been a question, philosophically, ethically, and scientifically. Robots could be considered an evolution of this idea, not made of flesh and bones, but silicon and metal. They can seemingly think for themselves and have personalities, but it is all an illusion, clever trickery to make it seem like they are doing these things with their own thought in mind. However, what matters to humans is whether the performance feels real or not. People are naturally indisposed to robots, especially the semi-realistic humanoids which fall into the uncanny valley, which generally refers to the uneasy feeling you get when you see something which looks human, but is just off enough that you know that it isn't. Many people find these robots disturbing or unlikable. There is a certain culture that can be observed now where people have fun messing around with or tormenting robots and AI. People find this sort of abuse on robots humorous, possibly since that robots are bounded by programming, and so abuse is met with amusing responses. When people argue against it, it is usually with the idea that when the robot uprising happens, they will treat you worse, which is an idea rooted in fear, as robots could easily kill people if programmed to. There have been many stories over the years of our own technology revolting against us, such as The Matrix or The Terminator. All fictional, of course, so far. A more realistic fear is that a psychopath could take this technology and specifically program it to hurt others. As robots can be so much stronger and sturdier than humans, it is a scary thought to think about fighting them. And of course the fact that robots might not even mean to hurt people. How does a robot know when it's hurting us? You can't yell at a robot arm to stop doing what it's programmed to do. Robots are wholly unnatural. They are mocked, feared, and reviled by a good portion of society. So all of this begs the question, how do you make the audience sympathise with robot characters? How do you make unfeeling machines appear feeling? Robot and AI technology seem to be improving by the day. Companies even now are advertising robot companions which you can buy and use. For now, these are all limited functionally, and tend to come down to being an Alexa with a screen and wheels. But even as simple as Amazon's Alexa is, they're being relied on in the home by many for day-to-day business. We have companies such as Boston Dynamics at the forefront of creating robots which have lifelike movements and mannerisms, even if they don't look particularly alive. But looks don't matter in this case, as these robots are made for functionality over style. Bomb defusal robots or robots made to rescue people from burning buildings don't need to look pretty as long as they do what they're meant to do. An exception to this is the robot dog, Spot, who while having functionality also displays a lot of character and style. Part of this reason is due to it being a quadruped rather than a biped, which allows greater balance and capabilities. But these robots are still quite scary to think about, especially thinking how much damage they could do if someone took to programming them to cause harm. For these reasons, companies vehemently market them as robot friends, cute and helpful. This makes the audience more susceptible to them as robots seem harmless and sweet. They are characterized by these companies to make them seem compassionate when they couldn't possibly understand that. There's something that feels quite cold and distant still, like you can tell they can't really feel anything behind the act. However, these robots are made for functionality first, and so characterization is more of an afterthought for marketing purposes. For a more sincere type of characterization, we must look at robots made for actual entertainment. Introducing the audio animatronic. First coined by Walt Disney, these are a type of robot which are meant to be a performer, an actor. They perform with motion, expression and sound, and were made by Disney to bring animated characters into the real world. You know they're not supposed to be a friend, they're supposed to perform. In this sense, these robots are some of the most useful to look at when looking how to make a robot character, as they are robots which are intended to be characters. Disney in particular has made grand leaps and bounds in bringing their characters to life in this way, and they have the money to create fantastically lifelike, impressive animatronics. These characters are littered throughout Disney parks, in dark rides, queues and even roller coasters. They give fantastic performances which really add to the experience. Another notable person I'd like to mention is John Wardley, who throughout his amazing career developed animatronics. In the 70s he appeared on the TV programme called Tomorrow's World, where he showcased his best work yet, the animatronic Charlie Pluckett, who could talk and sing. What made Charlie so revolutionary was the fact that his movements had what modern animators would call slow in and slow out. In other words, his movements were slower at the start and at the end of each move, as opposed to the stiff, single-speed movements which plagued most of the animatronics at the time. This was cited as making Charlie seem more real, and Two Swords Group would hire Wardley with the same technology to be used in their waxwork figures. Although by no means the most advanced, the Rockafire Explosion is probably my favourite collection of animatronic characters. For their time, they were very sophisticated, and they share a similar fluidity to their movements which Charlie Pluckett had. What makes these animatronics so amazing is how characterful and unique they all are. Showbiz Pizza was active from the late 70s to the mid-90s. The idea was a pizza restaurant with an animatronic band which would entertain the eating audience by performing live music, with comedy sketches and bantering in between. It was very unique and lucrative for a time, but people lost interest, which eventually led to the merging of Showbiz Pizza into rivals Chuck E. Cheese. Showbiz pizzas became Chuck E. Cheese's, and the Rockfire explosion got replaced by much inferior animatronics which remained stagnant for decades before animatronics were taken out entirely. A lot of what gives them their appeal is the performance of the animatronics, and the voice actors. It all feels very casual and relaxed, like a real, well-worn in-house band. I reached out to Aaron Fector via email, and he did respond. He told me that he thought that most of the appeal came from the people behind the animatronics, and that they were all based on the person voice acting them. He also told me that a large portion of his shows were improvised or ad-libbed to make them feel more like a group of friends hanging out. But the Rockfire explosion, as well as many animatronics from that era, have been criticised for being creepy in later years. This could be down to some of the robots hitting the uncanny valley. Other reasons could be the strange rubber masks, the ever-staring eyes, the often jerky movement, or the lack of different facial expressions making them impossible to read. Mostly I think it has been the thought of these robots being dead and still while not performing. I have heard several stories where kids were traumatised after finding the lifeless robots after crawling under the show curtain. Possibly it is all these factors rolled into one. I ran a survey asking a selection of people which characters from Rockfire they found the most appealing, and which they found the most creepy. The results were pretty interesting. Out of all 7 characters, the animatronics Rolf and Earl and Fats Geronimo were deemed the most appealing, whereas Mitzi Mozzarella and Looney-Bird were deemed the most unsettling. Rolf and Earl got a whopping 28% of voters voting him the most appealing member, with only 5% of voters voting him the least appealing, which was the most clear popularity to unpopularity ratio out of all the characters. Fats Geronimo scored 22% of popular votes, but also scored 11% of unpopularity votes. On the flip side, Mitzi Mozzarella and Looney-Bird each got 20% of unpopularity votes, with Mitzi also getting 6% of popularity votes and Looney-Bird getting 13%. Beach Bear and Duke LaRue only got 1 or 2 votes, here or there, which suggests to me that people are pretty impartial towards them. But most interesting to me is Billy Bob, who received a whopping 27% of votes on both sides of the argument, making him the most clearly divisive character in the roster. But what does this mean? Looking at the most popular characters, Rolf and Fats, we see that they are clearly the most anthropomorphic of the cast. While still heavily anthropomorphic in nature, and the fact that they have human proportions, they are still heavily recognisable as being their respective animals, a wolf and a gorilla. This is especially true for Fats. Mitzi, on the other hand, is perhaps regarded as more off-putting, as she is more heavily anthropomorphised, and has a strangely human face, makeup and hair. The fleshy human face is something that people have consistently pointed out for looking a bit creepy. She also has the largest mouth out of any character, which is perhaps a factor. Almost everything about her design tells us that she's meant to be the girl of a group, so the strange gender stereotypes forced on a mouse could be what people find so off-putting about her. Billy Bob is kind of a mixture of all this. He has a more animalistic looking body with a more human face with a large mouth, yet he's the most characterised out of all the members of the band and has his own backdrop. I've also heard people point out that his tooth is a bit off-putting, but others find it endearing. The character which surprised me the most was Looney-Bird, as I thought of all characters he was the most harmless, as he looks just like a silly bird in a barrel, being the least anthropomorphised of all the animatronics. However, from closer inspection I suspect that a lot of the dislike comes from the strangely human eyes, which, while on all animatronics, are especially noticeable on the least anthropomorphised characters. Coupled with the fact that they are forward-facing, indicating that Looney-Bird is a natural predator as opposed to prey, could also make him quite off-putting to people. The human eyes in general are what seems to be the most outwardly creepy thing about the animatronics, but what makes them seem most uncanny, like there's someone inside of them. Five Nights at Freddy's, or FNAF, it's an indie horror game series made by Scott Cawthon, which centres around a pizzeria much like the Showbiz or Chuck E. Cheese chains. You work the night shift and must fend off these animatronic characters, who are possessed by the souls of murdered children, and think you are their killer. This series is ultimately a horror game intended to frighten, however there are certain design philosophies and aspects we can still take from it. These are after all still animatronics, and we can see from fan reactions how some of them are viewed as scary and some aren't, even falling into cute territory. By analysing which fall into which category, we can determine which features are most and least desirable. FNAF 1 features characters which are most like the ones we see in real life. Animatronics are quite similar to some of the Chuck E. Cheese models, however they have a segmented appearance which emphasises the fact that they are robots, unlike real animatronics where as much of their internals as possible are covered to maintain illusion. Fan opinion on these designs is wholly positive, as they can look quite cute and unassuming in the right context, but can look incredibly unnerving in others. The creepiness mainly comes from the deep-set, staring eyes, the bulky, clunky bodies, and the double sets of individual teeth. So a lot of the same things we discussed about people not liking about a Rockfire explosion. FNAF Security Breach, on the other hand, has the most appealing animatronics from a cute standpoint. They are all very smooth looking and have no visible mechanical parts, as well as more appealing proportions both bodily and facially. The way these characters can visibly express human emotions really adds a level of appeal to them which other designs just don't have. The teeth are also much more fitting for the animals they represent. In my survey I also asked opinions on FNAF characters. I got many responses, but most were similar. Characters such as Roxy, Toy Bonnie, The Cupcake, Monty, Orville, Funtime Foxy, and Toy Chica were all mentioned multiple times as examples of cute or appealing characters. These are all characters who are clean and shiny, have bigger, more stylized eyes, less segmented bodies, or cuter proportions. There are also characters voted as least appealing or scariest. The most voted characters were Golden Freddy, Molten Freddy, Withered Bonnie, and especially Withered Chica and Springtrap. These are all characters who are dirty, ripped apart, or burned. Springtrap even has a visible corpse inside of it. These characters also have large amounts of robotic parts on display. Which brings up a massive issue of talking about animatronics in terms of robot design. They're hugely useful when talking about real robots with character, however animatronics are supposed to be those characters. In other words, they are an illusion. Acknowledging that they are animatronics, you break the illusion and that makes them creepier. So thinking of robots with animatronic design, you can't show that they are robots without them seeming incredibly creepy. For this reason we must look to robots who are supposed to be robots and characterful. To do this we must look to the world of fiction. Before Scott Cawthon worked on FNAF, he worked on a much lesser known game called The Desolate Hope. The game is wonderfully creative and I find Scott's art style here to be incredibly beautiful and unique. This game in fact gave me a lot of inspiration for my final film. You play as a sentient coffee machine, simply known as Coffee. Coffee is just an everyday object with a very simple design, and yet she is an incredibly lovable character due to her snarky mannerisms and desire to get the job done. Although her lines are few, we get to see a full character gleaming through in what we do have. Her expressions are mainly shown through the eyes and antenna, which works very well. It proves how designs can be incredibly simple, and so long as there's a strong personality behind them, they can be memorable and interesting. Another great example of this is in 1972's film Silent Running, which features 3 robots who look like big blocks of legs, and yet their mannerisms make them incredibly compelling as characters. There are hundreds of different robot designs in this game, from tiny clockwork fodder enemies to huge ones which take up part of a skyline, but the most interesting of these robots are the derelicts, huge imposing robots who seemingly lie dormant in their rooms. They all have incredibly complex designs and look very intimidating, but underneath the surface they aren't so. See, in the story of The Desolate Hope, these derelicts are sent off to distant planets to simulate whether human society could be built and maintained there. 5 were sent to each planet, and years after communications from Earth stopped, we as Coffee must work to make our 5 derelicts fulfill their missions. The further we go into the game, we find out more about the derelicts and the simulations and efforts. We grow fond of them, and instead of seeming intimidating, they seem sad or lonely or unfortunate. This is quite a powerful way of presenting a character, and makes us learn to love them not from appearance but from the way they act and think. This does, however, only work in specific cases, and works especially well in The Desolate Hope as it fits in with the story. These designs are also so amazing due to how distinctive and stylised they all are. They all feel incredibly unique and built to fit their specific character, which makes them all the more memorable and interesting. Wall-E needs no introduction. Probably the most beloved animated robot, there is a lot to learn from him in his world. If you can make people emotionally invested in a glorified trash compactor, you can make people emotionally invested in just about anything. Andrew Stanton and his team worked hard to make this a reality. They focused on the features of Wall-E which would give him the most personality, namely his eyes. As with Coffee from The Desolate Hope, it becomes evident that the eyes truly are the window to the soul, deconstructing and separating the human face to its core elements. Eyes, nose, mouths, and eyebrows. On their own, the eyes give us the most emotional information about a person. The mouth will also give us a semblance of emotion, however it is easily faked, as we can see from the research of French anatomist G.B. Duchenne, who was the first to recognise that when we display emotions for real, in particular happiness, we engage eye muscles subconsciously, which we don't when we fake them. This is why we can tell when people are faking a smile. For this reason, the eyes tell us the most about someone, so when choosing an element to highlight and design for emotional impact, it becomes apparent why they are chosen. The team worked very hard on Wall-E's eyes to give him the maximum range and depth of emotion possible, which is why they are such a prominent feature of his. Eve's as well is built around her eyes, which are all you see of her face, and all you need to see. The characters are both incredibly different in design, highlighting the difference of technology and shows how much it has moved on since Wall-E was made. This helps distinguish the characters as well. It doesn't matter that neither of these characters are realistic, because they look like they can do the things they are programmed to do, and incorporate emotions in a way that doesn't get in the way of that, which is partially why they are such strong characters. Because they were built with functionality in mind, and also have much more natural builds, they had to move in much more unique ways. As Andrew Stanton puts it, Wall-E couldn't pose like a human posed, he had to pose like a Wall-E posed. This is a great way of explaining that characters need to have movement suited to their character, which is part of the reason straight rotoscoping on motion capture tends to look a bit stilted and off-putting, as humans can only move like a human moves, not like a Wall-E moves. His personality and motivations were also utilised to great effect. Wall-E collects things to showcase his curiosity, which in turn reveals that in the many years since he was built he has evolved some sort of sensitivity. He's broken free of his programming to a degree, which shows the audience he isn't just a mindless drone. Wall-E in general does a fantastic job of show not tell. The whole first act has practically no dialogue, which works amazingly well, and allows the audience to take in the characters for their behaviour rather than their words. While Wall-E manages to have amazingly emotive robots while also not letting dialogue get in the way of story, Portal 2 basks in its story progressing dialogue. There is so much character and personality in the dialogue which works fantastically. It proves that dialogue can work extremely well with robot characters, and transforms the robots of Portal 2 into some of the most emotionally driven characters in fiction. This is amazing because it subverts expectations more than any other depiction of robots I've talked about. robots are accepted as being unfeeling and driven by programming. The robots of Portal 2's actions are usually driven either by emotions or boredom, which makes them more relatable, but what makes them so interesting is that they're primarily driven by extremely negative emotions. Anger, spite and malice pervade their actions along with bumbling, well-meaning stupidity, and yet instead of seeming scary, it makes them seem incredibly endearing. Take GLaDOS for example, who has a perhaps unfair grudge against the player, and frequently taunts and torments them, playing with them, toying with them, but over the course of the game she teams up with the player character Chell, and she changes and grows fond of her. Even then, GLaDOS' emotions dictate her actions, letting Chell go free, but not before serenading her twice, with lyrics full of turmoil and emotion. She's also shown to be incredibly impulsive, gaining valuable supplies, and then using them all up in a week. She also lets her fears dictate her actions and orders. Although rude and brash, she's very fun to listen to, and her tirades never get boring. Wheatley, on the other hand, is full of bluster and blind confidence in himself. He makes loads of bad decisions and usually speaks before he thinks, however he is very well-meaning and incredibly endearing because of that. He accompanies for the first half of the game, acting as a sort of guide before getting an ego trip and doing the same thing GLaDOS was doing before out of cockiness. However, he does redeem himself and remains a thoroughly enjoyable character. These two robots are at the heart of Portal 2, and watching them interact with each other is always hilarious. However, the game also has its share of non-speaking robots with a multiplayer campaign, with the robots which, like Wall-E, slowly gain empathetic tendencies and learn to love. The developers tested the concept with an in-house game, 2 Robots, 1 Wrench, where they discovered that the dialogue felt more natural when the robots were reacting to their environment and each other. It helped tie the world together and make it seem like they were really in the space. Visually, the robots are also quite interesting. These futuristic designs are reminiscent of Apple products and look very sleek. They also have a lot of visible moving parts, which is just an absolute treat to watch in motion. So many different movements allow a greater range of expression. This is especially cool as most of the characters are just eyes with various attachments. Wheatley and the other personality cores are basically eyeballs, GLaDOS is an eye and a robot arm, Atlas and Peabody are eyes with arms and legs, even the turret has an eye, and yet all of these characters can show such an incredible range of expression and emotion. So what does it all mean? We've learned from looking into animatronics that fluid movements do make a character feel more alive. They also teach us that we must focus on not only delivering visual performance, but also vocal performance, and that a voice actor should have the chemistry to make it more natural. But most importantly, we must not make the characters resemble a human, eyes being the worst offender. Giving them more stylized eyes, more stylized mouths, no teeth, and more characterful proportions will help make them not look terrifying. It is also worth mentioning that damage to the characters should not be overwhelming to the overall design, and especially not on the face. Looking at her films and games, we learn that eyes are the most important feature to get right for emotion, and focus should be put on the detail which matters with the character and their functionality in the universe. Complicated designs can look amazing, but so can simple ones. The best design is not always the most complex, and that can sometimes make the character look more imposing anyway. This can be used to subvert expectations, however only in situations where that makes sense. Each character should look very distinctive and unique, and move in different ways to make them more characterful and memorable. Dialogue is not necessarily important, but can be utilised effectively. With or without, 2 wildly different robots interacting with each other can be very satisfying and provides a unique dynamic for the audience. Not being afraid to make the robots emotional, even with negative emotions, can really help them feel like they are more than just robots. Flaws don't ruin a character, they make them feel more relatable and grounded. They should also be reactive, to make them feel like they really are a part of the universe they are in. For my 3rd year project, I am making a film which centres around 2 robots. I've used this research to try and push the concept to its limits. They will both not speak in order to let their interactions and behaviour tell the story, although they will both make unique sounds derived from slide whistles that I have been working on to make fit the characters. They are set in a post-apocalyptic future, so damage is a must. However, I have mainly limited it to dirt and scratches and general wear, in order to limit the possibility of them being seen as creepy. I want to make them both look very distinct, so they both feel like separate characters who are connected by story alone. Both robots have their own thoughts and feelings, and will show anger, embarrassment and despair among more positive emotions throughout the film. I hope this will make them feel more layered and relatable. Mick is a huge robot who is basically an electric city. At the centre of his city is his body, which is an eye. I really like the way Portal 2 used eyes as designs, and after reading into it, it made sense as he can show a lot of expression while not needing a typical body. He has a lot of moving parts which allows for greater expression, which you can see in the tests I have made of him. I thought that I could work on making him imposing like the robots in The Desolate Hope, as he is of a similar concept. However, I wanted to make his movements and behaviour very casual and approachable to show that he is not scary. The imposing nature is mainly for story reasons, as you are unsure if he supports Ramona's love of flowers until the end. For Ramona, I was conscious that I wanted to make a humanoid character, but avoid anything that made her look remotely human. I elected to give her a monitor for a head with a heavily stylised face which can still show a lot of emotion. I gave her stretchy arms to make her more fit for her in-universe purpose, which involves a lot of reaching into difficult places. Her longer arms also allow for movement unique to her. In conclusion, this research has helped me create the core building blocks of my film, and will continue to help me well into my animation process. I've used a selection of robots from the real world, films, games, and even some books to see what works and what doesn't. And all these different things, emotions, performance, motivations, designs, and more, all contribute in making a layered character which the audience can get invested in. But most importantly, you must find them a heart and a soul which can be seen behind steel eyes.